Welcome to our Culturally Responsive Teaching webinar focused on engagement and learning. This webinar will focus on what culturally responsive teaching is and what it is not. It will give you strategies, target best practices, and discuss the importance of high-impact learning experiences. Please have paper and writing utensils ready to make notes during this webinar as we look not only at information but ask some probing questions. This will be called a reflection journal for the sake of clarity. Let's get started by defining what culturally responsive teaching looks like in the classroom in terms of student engagement and learning. First, culturally responsive teaching is not a predetermined curriculum. It's not a specific set of strategies. It's not a watering down of the curriculum. It's not a feel-good approach or only for students of particular backgrounds. One of the biggest misconceptions about culturally responsive teaching is thinking you have to tie the lesson's content to, say, African American or Latino students' racial background. The common belief is if you mention Africa or Mexico or famous black and brown high achievers, it will spark students' attention. Then they will be motivated to participate, and this is not the case. Culturally responsive teaching is a mindset that respects and honors students' individuality as well as their cultures, experiences, and histories. It's a way to include these in the curriculum and through teaching approaches. It's a commitment to continuing to learn about one student's individuality as well as their cultures, experiences, and histories. Some culturally responsive dispositions include engaging in critical self-reflection about one's values, biases, strengths, and limitations, and how these can affect one's effectiveness with students of diverse backgrounds. Valuing language and culture in word and deed. Insisting on high quality and excellent work from all students. Affirming students' identities while also expanding their world. Honoring families, and exemplifying a commitment to lifelong learning. Some practical examples for setting the stage for successful culturally responsive teaching include the following. Learn to say students' names correctly. Label a classroom with languages spoken by students. Display the work of all students. Learn as much as you can about your students. Get to know your students' families by engaging in authentic family outreach. Possibly learn another language. And learn about and become involved in the community where your school is. Many of these examples are addressed in the other webinars which show the interconnectedness of culturally responsive teaching. Let's look now at some of these practices. So how do you ensure culturally responsive teaching is engaging and students are learning? First, you have to create a physical setting that supports academic and social goals. Second, you establish expectations for behavior. Third, you communicate with students in culturally consistent ways. Fourth, you develop a caring classroom environment. Fifth, you work with your families. And lastly, use appropriate interventions to assist students with behavior problems. In the webinar on management, cultural proficiency receptivity is discussed in depth, but let's look at how bias might affect engagement and learning according to brain research. Issues of race, privilege, and belonging can trigger our internal alarms in cross-cultural teacher-student relationships. Believe it or not, teachers' implicit bias and students' disengagement are two different defense responses to the brain's efforts to keep us safe and happy. So here are 3 brain rules to help you better understand implicit bias and its effects. Brain rule 1. While the brain isn't wired to be racist, it uses biases as unconscious defense shortcuts. Therefore, because of the way our brains are wired, we are naturally groupist. The brain has a strong need for relatedness. This wiring for groupism usually leads the dominant culture, the in-group, in a race-based society to create out-groups based on race, gender, language, and sexual orientation. A system of inequity is maintained by negative social messages that dehumanize people of color, women, LGBT, and other minority persons as the other. For folks in the in group, the brain takes in these messages and downloads them like software into the brain's fear system. This leads to implicit bias, the unconscious attitudes and beliefs that shape our behavior towards someone perceived as inferior or as a threatening outsider. The challenge for teachers is to become aware of their own implicit bias, which isn't easy. Here are some tips for bringing implicit bias to consciousness. Check your assumptions. Are there other ways to interpret a student's behavior or reaction? Do your assumptions take into account social inequities or the stress of oppression in a racialized society? Look for patterns of inequity. Who do you call on most often? Who gets disciplined most often? What's behind the discipline issues? And pay attention to your body sensations that signal fear or a sense of threat. During an incident, be sure to check your assumptions about why you are responding to a specific student with frustration, suspicion, or even lower expectations. This can help rewire your brain's messages about that student. Brain Rule 2. The brain uses the nervous system to sniff out implicit bias. Remember the brain's strong need for relatedness? Our need to be connected to a caring community and maintain a sense of identity is so critical to our survival that the brain has developed the ability to actually sniff out threats. It's called neuroception and happens when the brain's neural circuits send information to the brain's fear center to determine if new situations or people are safe or dangerous. It's like a watchdog. The amygdala in the fear center is designed to react in less than a second at the very hint of a social threat. In the case of cross-racial relationships, neuroception heightens students' awareness of a teacher's threatening microaggressions based on race or ethnicity. Microaggressions are those very subtle, everyday verbal and nonverbal slights, snubs, or insults driven by implicit bias that serve to invalidate positive group identity or trivialize the experience or capacity of those in the out group. Here are tips to avoid triggering students' stress response to bias. Learn what rapport and connection look like in different cultures and begin using some of those tools. For example, socializing over food is a common way to connect. Practice affirmation and validation. Acknowledge students' potential for rigorous learning. Show that you are aware of the socio-political context that marginalizes and invalidates the experiences of youth of color, especially English learners and African American boys. Both groups are the usual targets of implicit bias. And Brain Rule 3, trust calms the brain's watchdog. The antidote to triggering the amygdala in the brain's fear center is building trust. Neuroscience tells us the brain feels safest and relaxed when we are connected to others we trust to treat us well. It responds by secreting oxytocin, called the bonding hormone. Just as cortisol is the brain's alert signal to go into defense mode, oxytocin is the brain's signal for the amygdala to stand down and relax. Here are some tips for building trust across the differences. Be vulnerable and real with your students. Share some of your life experiences so they see you as human, not just the authority figure. And in return, listen to their stories. Create affinities and connections around similarities you and your students share. Maybe it's a love of a particular sports team or a social justice cause. The research is clear. One of the fastest ways to rewire our implicit biases is to redefine the in-group and out-group. Let's look at the neuroscience behind some of the issues with culturally responsive teaching. Some practices of effective culturally responsive teachers include positive perspectives on parents and families. Teachers believe that parents and families are critical partners in students' education. Teachers communicate early and often with parents and families and invite them to participate in their students' education in specific ways. Communication of high expectations. Everyone involved in students' academic lives delivers the same message. All students are expected to achieve high standards. Teachers understand student behavior in light of the culture's and community's norms. Teachers view all students as possessing important knowledge and experience. Learning within the context of culture or reshaping the curriculum. Teachers adapt lessons and their classroom environments to reflect styles of learning and communicating that are familiar to students and consistent with their culture. Teachers plan interdisciplinary lessons and units and help students make connections between their lives and what they are learning in school. The teacher is a facilitator. The teacher guides, mentors, and mediates within the classroom environment. The classroom is student-centered instruction. Learning is cooperative and collaborative. Students have opportunities to direct their own learning and choose projects that are relevant to their own situations. And culturally mediated instruction. Lessons and instruction integrate diverse ways of knowing. Multicultural viewpoints and contributions are included at appropriate times throughout the year. Remember the graphic from the first webinar on culturally responsive teaching? Do we insert culture into education or education into culture? Has this statement come to have a little different meaning to you? The following slides are examples of lessons created to bring culturally responsive teaching to life in the classroom. They can be adapted to address different cultures and different grades using the same basic framework. Remember, it should be authentic, personal, and meaningful. Let's look at the first lesson. Please get out your reflection journal to answer questions following the reading of each of these lessons. The first lesson is an African American history lesson. In this lesson, first have students share their personal histories. This fosters verbal and writing abilities, encourages chronological thinking, and teaches about the gathering of data to create a history. The histories also allow students and teachers a chance to explore one another's racial identities and personal experiences. Have students discuss the following. What compelling differences do you find in your history and those of others? Considering the challenges others face, how might you interact with them differently in the future? Now some food for thought for you, the teacher. How could you adapt this lesson for different cultures? Do you feel this lesson is rigorous? Why or why not? If yes, what level do you think it is? If not, how could you increase the rigor? Let's look at another lesson. This is a Native American reading lesson. In this lesson, students learn about the role that hunting and gathering play in Native American culture, as well as family roles and relationships while developing reading comprehension and vocabulary skills. Bring in different types of berries for students to identify and they can snack on once the lesson is complete. Have them study a map of local flora and fauna. Suggested readings could include Robert McCloskey's Blueberries for Sal or Lindsay George's Around the Pond. Distribute a printed recipe for freezer jam and have students circle the nouns and verbs. Offer extra credit if students work with a family member at home to make the jam and share details about the experience with the class. So how could you adapt this lesson for different cultures? Do you feel like this lesson is rigorous? Why or why not? Could this be modified to work at your grade level? A third lesson is on Hispanic literature. Jumping into Shakespeare is rarely considered an easy or welcome task for students, but putting it into context of their own culture can make a difference. Using the themes of family and cultural tension in Romeo and Juliet, students will be able to compare and contrast their own family relationships with their classmates, read for specific information, draw conclusions, and develop a vocabulary relevant to the materials. After reading passages from the play, have students discuss and write answers for the following questions that follow the play's examination of family and culture clashes. Who is the head of my household? Why? Are all family members equally responsible for the protection of the family unit? Should final decisions always be made in the same manner? Are families closer to each other on happy occasions or in crisis? How does where a family lives affect them? As an extended lesson, have students compile questions to ask their parents and grandparents, comparing family life during their childhood and today. And again, in your reflective journal, answer the questions on the slide. How could you adapt this lesson for different cultures? Do you feel like this lesson is rigorous? Why or why not? Could this be modified to work at your grade level? And finally, the fourth lesson is an Asian American business and marketing lesson. For this lesson, have students select a magazine and compare the number of ads featuring Asian American models with the total number of ads and describe the product and company that any Asian American model is promoting. As a discussion or writing prompt, ask, does the ad maintain or break common stereotypes about Asian Americans? Does it contain potentially derogatory images or language? If you could recreate the ad, how might you do so? The lesson helps students understand how advertising constructs or deconstructs stereotypes about Asian Americans. It leads to discussions of students' cultures and promotes critical thinking and composition skills. Please take a moment in your reflective journal and answer the questions on the slide. How could you adapt this lesson for your cultures? Do you feel like this lesson is rigorous? Why or why not? And could this be modified to work at your given grade level? My question for you is, as you wrote in your reflection journal, did you find some ideas of ways you could modify and implement these tasks or others and put practices of these into your own classroom? Culturally responsive teaching using evidence-based practices can have a huge impact on culturally and linguistically diverse learners' development because it provides a teaching that draws from students' relevant schemas, background, and home languages. It also allows students to practice what they are taught. For example, various classroom studies have indicated that students make greater improvement in reading comprehension when teachers intertwine instructional engagement approaches with skills-based practices that assist students with integrating new learning information. Let's look at some of these evidence-based practices. Culture, language, and racial identity refer to the complex constructs that develop from psychological and socially inherited knowledge and experiences. Enculturation and socialization continually shape culture, language, and racial identity. Enculturation is the process by which students become knowledgeable of and competent in their communities throughout life. And socialization is the process of behaving based on the accepted norms and values of the culture or society the individual experiences. It can entail a group of people united or classified based on history, nationality, or geographic distribution. Culture and linguistic experiences can help shape students' identities. Learning may be difficult for many students because many of them encounter formal schooling as separate from their cultural, linguistic, and racial experiences. Culturally responsive methods provide teachers with the critical understanding of how students' cultural, linguistic, and racial identities develop and how these constructs impact learning. Another evidence-based practice is critical thinking. An important component of culturally responsive thinking is the ability to instruct students to think critically. Critical thinking is the ability to think for oneself, apply reasoning and logic to new or unfamiliar ideas, analyze ideas, make inferences, and solve problems. These methods provide teachers with the skills to teach students how to become critical thinkers by integrating their cultural and linguistic experiences with challenging learning experiences involving higher order thinking and critical inquiry. For example, in Funds of Knowledge, a well-researched critical thinking mediation, researchers showed teachers how to integrate their teaching with students' home experiences. One example from this method involved using students' international traveling experiences along with their parents' skills and knowledge to reinforce classroom skills-based instruction by forming native language literacy circles with parents to explain and foster critical analysis skills. This allows teachers to look past their own views of the world, better understand the thought of others, and form more cogent and well-rounded teaching, which allow them to improve students' critical thinking skills. Research during the past few decades has developed the foundation for evidence-based practices that supports teaching for students who struggle with learning basic academic skills. However, despite this research, many culturally and linguistically diverse learners continue to underachieve in United States public schools. There are 4 emerging evidence-based practices for students from cultural and linguistically diverse backgrounds: collaborative teaching, responsive feedback, modeling, and instructional scaffolding. Let's drill these 4 best practices down. First is collaborative teaching. Collaborative teaching is an umbrella term for instructional methods such as cooperative learning, differentiated instruction, peer teaching, or reciprocal teaching. They involve joint intellectual effort requiring individual accountability, positive interdependence, and strong interpersonal skills between students and teachers. Collaborative learning methods are a key component of culturally responsive teaching. They enable participants to share and learn from their collective experiences and challenges. Research indicates that practitioners who use direct and explicit collaborative-based approaches to learning to reinforce students' background knowledge, such as interdependence, sharing, and collaboration, improve student literacy, engagement, and motivation. In collaborative-based instruction, teachers provide a common introduction to lessons and then distribute learning assignments based on students' academic skills, such as their reading language level. Although all students learn about the same topic, the assignments may vary according to the student's ability. Teachers collectively organize students into heterogeneous learning teams by grouping based on learning abilities. After students have read and identified the assignment, they discuss the topic with their group members, share their knowledge, and complete the lesson as a whole group. Teachers monitor and review the key concepts and skills all students should have acquired. If learning challenges persist, teachers may need to reciprocate and teach specific skills for student understanding. For example, there have been several studies that have used collaborative-based learning approaches to engage students in small groups in content-related strategic discussions to assist students in understanding concepts, deriving the main ideas, asking and answering questions, and relating what they are learning to their own cultural backgrounds. When students did not have the background knowledge to understand concepts in text passages, they were encouraged to generate questions for understanding that were discussed in small groups with the teacher facilitating comprehension. The second evidence-based practice is responsive feedback. Culturally responsive feedback is provided when teachers offer critical, ongoing, and immediate feedback regarding students' responses and participation. Through culturally responsive feedback, teachers supply individualized support regarding performance in a manner sensitive to students' individual and cultural preferences. This strategy includes incorporating students' responses, ideas, languages, and experiences into the feedback that is provided, while inviting students to construct new understandings regarding what they are learning. Providing responsive feedback is an instructional strategy recommended as a necessary practice in effective instruction with students experiencing academic difficulty. In order to engage in this critical feedback exchange, teachers must create multiple opportunities for students to respond and fluidly dialogue throughout the day. Scheduling opportunities for individualized teacher-student conferences allows students opportunities to receive individualized teacher feedback. Overall, students benefit from ongoing specific feedback to increase their self-esteem, monitor their understanding, and challenge their thinking. The third evidence-based practice is for students from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds is modeling. Teacher modeling has long been viewed as an essential component of effective teaching. As a culturally responsive practice, modeling involves explicit discussion of instructional expectations while providing examples based on students' cultural, linguistic, and lived experiences. Culturally responsive modeling requires teachers to exemplify learning outcomes, which include strategy use, content learning, metacognitive and critical thinking, and interest and respect for cultural and linguistic diversity. Research has established the modeling of skills, strategies, and new content as an essential and effective method for teaching English learners. Similarly, research on CRT practices emphasizes modeling as a key strategy for specific cultural groups. For example, within American Indian and Alaskan Native communities, learning through observation is an important tradition. In an investigation involving indigenous Alaskan youth, researchers observed expert apprentice modeling during math problem-solving activities reflective of this indigenous group's cultural practice. Engaging in an essential cultural practice within instruction can validate students' group heritages while demonstrating its importance to academic tasks. Culturally responsive modeling serves to illustrate specific cognitive strategies while drawn from students' cultures, languages, and everyday experiences. And the fourth evidence-based practice is instructional scaffolding. Culturally responsive instructional scaffolding occurs when teachers control for task difficulty and promote a deeper level of understanding using students' contributions and their cultural and linguistic backgrounds. Scaffolding skills include using different types of questions, such as open-ended questions or analytic questions, providing appropriate wait times and taking turns, extending and acknowledging students' responses, and using supporting instructional materials, such as visual organizers or story maps. Researchers have integrated scaffolding methods in studies involving students experiencing academic difficulty, including students who speak a second language. For instance, scaffolding may include reference to English language learners' primary languages or cultures. Culturally responsive research further demonstrates the effectiveness of this strategy in facilitating student success and self-esteem during teaching episodes. Although current empirical research is somewhat lacking, we encourage you to use a problem-solving approach and child-centered practices during instruction. Problem-solving requires teachers to create opportunities for students to investigate real open-ended problems, formulate questions, and develop solutions to genuine challenging situations. Engaging students in solving meaningful problems allows for complex and higher-order thinking while increasing students' motivation to learn and resolve authentic issues in their daily lives. Teachers create opportunities for students to critique, challenge, and transform examples of injustice or inequity in their daily lives and communities. Therefore, problem-solving becomes culturally responsive when students address problems that touch upon cultural and linguistic issues for the purpose of improving their own daily lives. Some examples may include gathering and critiquing additional sources to supplement textbook curriculum to better reflect students' cultural and linguistic backgrounds, investigating colleges with supportive programs for diverse students, and collecting oral histories from community elders regarding topics of study. This instructional approach not only identifies and challenges community inequities that may exist, but also allows students to devise solutions toward meaningful change. Culturally responsive problem solving encourages students to care about their communities. Students' contributions drive the teaching and learning process in a culturally responsive classroom as teachers develop culturally responsive learning opportunities and outcomes focused on student-generated ideas, background knowledge, values, communication styles, and preferences. Student-centered instruction, choice, and participation are central to CRT practices. Researchers studying American Indian educational systems and communities found that given that these children are allowed a high level of autonomy and decision-making in their homes and communities, American Indian students may be more comfortable and more motivated to participate in activities that they generate, organize, or direct themselves. This practice is true for many diverse communities. In effective culturally responsive classrooms, teachers provide opportunities for choice in classroom activities, encourage child-directed learning, and assist students as they engage in these activities. Teachers create opportunities for students to make decisions regarding the content and form of instruction and support that students need to self-regulate their learning. Instructional conversation, an example of a child-centered practice, focuses on facilitating student dialogue in which students engage in conversations about academic content while establishing connections to personal, cultural, family, and community knowledge. Research support for these practices is emerging. For example, the What Works Clearinghouse found instructional conversations in literature logs to demonstrate the promising effects on reading achievement and English language development in English language learners. So how do we increase student engagement and learning in culturally responsive environments or truly any environment? Gamify it. Games are the powerful strategy for culturally grounded learning because they get the brain's attention and require active processing. Attention is the first step in learning. We cannot learn, remember, or understand what we don't first pay attention to. Call and response is just a way to get the brain's attention. Most games employ a lot of the cultural tools you'd find in oral traditions. repetition, solving a puzzle, or making connections between things that don't seem to be related. Make it social. Organizing learning so that students rely on each other will build on diverse students' communal orientation. This communal orientation can be summed up in the African proverb, "I am because we are." Even making learning slightly competitive in a good-natured way increases students' level of attention and engagement. It's why the TV show Survivor has been around for so many years. It's a social-based game. Storify it. The brain is wired to remember stories and to use the story structure to make sense of the world. That's why every culture has creation stories. In oral tradition, stories play a bigger role in teaching lessons about manners, morality, or simply what plants to eat or not eat in the wilderness because it's the way content is remembered. Diverse students, and all students really, learn content more effectively if they can create a coherent narrative about the topic or process presented. That's the brain's way of weaving it all together. And the bonus is that it offers a great way to check for understanding and correct misconceptions. Culturally responsive teaching doesn't have to be some performance the teacher does to entertain students, and it doesn't have to mention race or reference culture at all. Instead, what makes a practice culturally responsive is that it mimics students' own cultural learning tools. So the key for you is to consistently use these strategies regularly as part of your instructional routine, rather than doing them randomly every now and then. We hope this webinar provided you some insights and strategies into student engagement and learning in a culturally responsive classroom. I encourage you to reflect on your new learning and consider some ways to embed CRT into your classroom. As a reminder, there's no order to this series. However, I would suggest that you watch all of the series to have a better overall picture of what can be done in the culturally responsive classroom for you and your students.